You know, it's weird. WoW's been out for such a long time now that the classes themselves have a history. They have developed and changed in such ways that they barely resemble what they originally started with. I wonder how people feel. They rolled a character in vanilla, and now they're playing the same class, but is it the same as what it was? Is it what they signed up for? How has it actually changed over time? Perhaps you're new to the game and you've no idea what they were like before. I've already talked about how rogues used to use shields, or bucklers as we were called then originally, and now we consider them to just be a straight up DPS class. The rogue itself is awesome. They're one of the coolest looking characters in the game. They've had access to more legendary weapons than anybody, I think. And ultimately, it's kind of interesting to see how the rogue has changed. Originally, the thief class. Every RPG needs a thief class. If we check the font of all knowledge, that we know that the thief class actually came in every RPG, including board games. This is kind of one of the problems with the rogue. It started out as the original RPG type of thief. Lockpicking, distraction, stealing. But that isn't really what it's turned into now. We don't really consider that a vital part of being a rogue. I think we should look at how this changed. Let's look at how the rogue legacy has developed. It's no wonder so many people rolled a rogue originally. The game was like, what the fuck is diminishing returns, and even an average rogue could stunlock some tanks to death. But it's cool, there were so many flavour of the game rerollers that a huge proportion of rogues never realised their potential. Otherwise the game would obviously have been imbalanced. Thank you, bad guys. Thank you. Rogues did have some problems in the early life of the game though. Blizz was pretty rigid about sticking to the Code of Thieves. They had more profession systems than any other class in the game. Poisons and lockpicking had their own profession screens. You actually had to level them. We had poison vendors selling various materials to create different ranks of poisons. And if you didn't bother to level them, you could end up at high level with original poisons that didn't actually matter too much, as most guilds didn't let you use poisons in raiding, so it wouldn't screw up the damage debuffs. I think the worst of the poison tree was blind. You know, that ability that you get to use whenever you want now? Well, back in the day, using blind actually cost a reagent called blinding powder. I mean, how did it even make sense? You're essentially throwing dirt in somebody's eyes. Why would I need to have a special powder to do that? Blinding powder had to be created from a mid-level herb called Fade Leaf, which meant you had to buy it from the auction house or go and farm it yourself. At least Blizz acknowledged how stupid this was when they eventually removed the need for blinding powder. Herbing and vendors wasn't the only method to get your reagents though. In 1.2, lockboxes also had a chance to drop rogue materials, which was a nice addition. The only problem was lockpicking needed leveling as well, and it was a total pain in the ass. Similar to herbs, there were zones where certain mobs had a chance to drop a lockbox if you pickpocketed them, and gain a level by opening it. As you can imagine, most Flavour of the Month rerollers would never do this, and as such, most capped rogues couldn't even open basic lockboxes. It was a crazy time for rogues. Talented sap had a 10% chance of breaking you out of stealth, so CCing in a dungeon always carried the risk that you'd be instantly killed. But the classic roguelike skills would eventually pay off, and the only encounter in vanilla who actually needed rogues? The suppression room. Blackwing Lair. The irony that the most hated room in the game was the one that rogues shined in. I'm not lying that people hated rogues. A classic factor in rogue power was Eviscerate having enormous base damage, with little effect from gear itself. This gave rise to the popular naked rogue killing cat/geared characters videos spamming the internet, although some of these videos were actually hilarious, so that's kinda cool. In PvP, the primary enemy of the rogue was casters until later in the game. Engineering became almost a must-have for dedicated PvPers. Gnomish death rays, spell reflection trinkets, evening up the odds of being exploded if caught out of stealth, but it wasn't a bad time. The mechanics of the game allowed for some hilarious moments. Our own Grand Marshal Team Mender Methodical reminisces about the Hand of Justice, a level 53 trinket which allowed a chance for extra swings of your weapon. And then Sword Specialization in the combat tree, which did exactly the same thing, only they could actually proc off the proc. He killed a gold farmer trying to take a thorium node off him just from the cheap shot and the procs going off. As gear got better, rogues became one of the most staple members of 40-man raids. 6 to 8 rogues per raid was considered ideal, not only bringing dominant DPS, but also being in control of their threat in a time when threat really mattered. The Burning Crusade. TBC didn't bring much in the way of changes for rogues. Mutilate was added, and now rogues were allowed to use poisons in raids, with the debuff adjustment, but then countered by adding poison immune bosses. Thanks so much for that. So combat it is. A new stat called Haste came in, and though it seems this one hadn't really been thought out properly. It's kind of pre-Math the Magicians, and haste items were rare until the Black Temple, unless of course you were a blacksmith. Almost immediately, every rogue worth his salt re-rolled to smithing and began working on Dragon Strike, a mace with a haste proc, combined with a rare shitty odd item that had haste on it, and of course the Grail of the Burning Crusade, the item still farmed weekly until the end of the expansion. The Dragon Spine Trophy enabled smarter rogues to top entire raids' early DPS by 20 to 30%. Not only that, but we cannot have the Kings of Murder held back by casters anymore. Now it's the time for Cloak of Shadows. Cloak was an outrage to most at release. How can the already OP ganker rogues now be immune to our spells? Of course it was created with balance in mind, but the whine did not go unheard, and Cloak was quickly removed from preparation. TBC wasn't the best time for PvP for rogues. Resilience was here and it was here to stay. It destroyed the rogue PvP playstyle early in the expansion. Rogues simply could not put out enough damage to compete against the new giant health pools and score a kill. And suddenly, World of Roguecraft was dead and buried. People re-rolled away with no hope in sight. And for the first time since WoW had launched, the Rogue was no longer the most played class in the game. It wasn't until the mid-Burning Crusade that these issues were addressed. The class received heavy changes. A new spell called Shadow Step was added to allow mobility. Hemorrhage was buffed through the teeth, and Cheat Death was completely reworked and became, well, let's be honest, massively overpowered. Originally, it was bugged, returning the rogue to 10% health and reducing damage to 99% instead of the intended 90%. The new Cheat Death allowed rogues to not only stand on their own feet, but in the arena include a lot of PvE gear into their setups, and with huge protection from Cheat Death, like a flash, rogues were back and dominating. With the addition of Warglaives, the rogue had a very happy ending to the expansion in PvP, and with the first class to break the 4k DPS barrier in PvE. The Wrath of the Lich King. The snows of Northrend brought good tidings. Fan of Knives. Finally a spell to do some form of AoE damage. 2 expansions we had waited, and here it was. But not only that, Tricks of the Trade came as well. So now our ninja pulling for slow tanks wouldn't be as dangerous as it had been in the past. A minor problem with this was how powerful Fan was. Originally, Fan of Knives also interrupted any caster who got hit. Who the fuck thought this was a good idea? Of course, this allowed the rise of arena teams who only casted Fan of Knives and destroyed. It also did too much damage. By Ulduar, if you had more than one mob to DPS, Fan was a huge DPS increase. Rogues even got Dismantle, something that rogues have been crying out for, but only now. It wasn't just a disarm, it also removed shields. Such a good time. Fan was the order of the day. Unfair advantage was genius until it was quickly hammered into the ground by Blizz, allowing a rogue to instantly attack back whenever the rogue dodged or parried, meaning that, well, just watch this. For the third time, combat was the spec to go, all the way until Ice Crown. Not that it didn't have some problems. Killing Spree was the new big hitter. Also the spell that cost the lives of many a rogue when used at the wrong time. And it still happens today. As time went on, the sneaky rogue started to take note of the new stat added to the game, armor penetration. Originally classed as a waste of time, as people were able to reach 100%, it became more and more attractive. But then it was discovered that you could go over cap armor penetration and do bonus damage on top. Overnight, every rogue regemmed, restatted to full armor penetration. As armor was a flat number, clothies with low armor were eaten alive by ARP rogues. I guess befitting both PvE and PvP, the energy change was the biggest factor. Previously, energy restored in chunks at a time, brought in smooth energy regen we know of today, allowing the use of abilities much quicker and with more planning. It wasn't until Arthas opened his doors that history was made. Out of the blue assassination was given an enormous buff, and for the first time in World of Warcraft, combat was no longer the superior PvE spec. Surprisingly, the very old school rogues actually complained. I likes me my rogue with swords, they declared. PvP was similar to that of TBC. Rogues started weak in comparison, especially next to the new hero class DK Overlords. But once they were dripping in cool items, they got some nice representation in those top teams. Cataclysm. Cata brought with it the fancy new Force 31-point talent systems, which hurt rogues more than any other class. The ability to mix around certain talents was an integral part of rogue life, especially with risky talents like Killing Spree not really being very favourable. The Fires of Deathwing also allowed 3 talent specs to be viable in PvE for the first time. Sub got a solid representation on a few fights, and by the Dragon Soul the rogue proved vital to certain encounters, and guilds were recruiting them en masse. The Smoke Bomb. This was the big addition, and hugely overpowered. It is rare to see a spell change so much so quickly, but Smoke Bomb was nerfed nearly almost every week after launch, which was disappointing to some rogues. For PvP, it was a nice change of pace. Compared to the previous expansions, a solid pace from start to finish in 3v3 and considered not too weak and not too powerful throughout. They had representation going all the way from the bottom to the top. I guess the ultimate tribute to the rogue was the specific legendary daggers for the rogue. A class quest which was tailored to all the rogue abilities was met with universal appraise, and although the Fangs of the Father were not the coolest looking items in the game, they looked superb and a nice tribute to the classic rogue style from the vanilla days. Well, there you go. That's the legacy of the rogue. They've changed a lot since vanilla. There's a few things in there that we should talk about, like the idea that we did have to collect resources for poisons. So weird that the idea that that was going to be okay was introduced into the game. I should have mentioned, I guess, that poisons themselves used to disappear when you zoned. Little life inconveniences like that. So you would enter a BG, put your poisons on and win, and if you went into the next BG you would have to put your poisons on again. Remember, of course, these were poisons that you had to make yourself. They weren't in your spellbook. But now in Mist of Pandaria, it's not quite finished yet, so we can't comment entirely, but they have been one of the strongest melee classes, surviving this caster dominance that we've seen throughout the expansion, kind of alongside the DK. Whereas other melee has fallen behind, the rogue has been there, standing its own ground. It's a wonderful class. It's one of the best classes I've ever played. I'm not a fan of thieves. I never have been. When it comes to sneaking around, it's not really for me. It's too slow. I prefer to get in there and get nitty gritty, which is why the warrior has generally been my favourite class. But I can see the appeal of the rogue, and I always had fun on my rogue whenever I played it. I'm looking forward to looking at some other classes, so why don't you give the video a like if you want to see more legacies of other classes. Let me know what you think. Alright guys, bye.